In a prior episode, we used CSS to globally apply custom icons to the Fluid Action menu. As we ended that episode, I suggested we cover the classic approach in a future episode. Well, it's time. First though, why classic? And I'm going to use the term classic for both classic and classic plus because they're basically the same. But again, why classic? So looking at the statistics, roughly 95% of the components delivered with PeopleSoft today are still classic. Yes, Fluid is our future, and Fluid is Oracle's strategic direction. And most of self-service today is Fluid. But most of PeopleSoft is not self-service, and is therefore still classic. Okay, with that said, let's review our Fluid Action menu. Returning to the Approvals component, notice the icons next to each action menu. We set that up in a prior episode. Now let's navigate to a classic page. How about Query Manager? Great. Okay, so now let's inspect the HTML used to generate this menu to see how we might have to transform or change our CSS to work with the classic HTML. So inspecting, I see the link, I see the menu item, and I see menu section. That sounds very similar to what we used in Fluid. Now notice though that it's only highlighting as I hover over the menu section, it's only highlighting the top 3 menu items. What about those lower 3 items? Apparently they're using different HTML, so we're going to have to deal with those 3 separately. Now let's keep working our way up through the HTML to see if we can find some sort of an ID, some sort of a selector we can use for the entire container. Perfect. Here as I hover over the action link container HTML element, I see it is highlighting and selecting the entire menu. That's perfect. Okay, great. Next thing I want to do is open a text editor here in my web browser so I can paste in the Fluid CSS that we created in a prior episode and use that as our starting point and then retrofit that for Classic. So I'm going to grab that action link container ID, that's our outer selector, and start updating the CSS with our new selector. Oh, did you see that? As I pasted in the outer selector, the top 3 menu items shifted to the right, making space on the left for our icons. That's perfect. So we're halfway done with the menu, just right there. Now, we're going to have to figure out how to apply the same attributes to the lower 3 links, but we'll deal with that in a minute. While we have the outer selector on our clipboard, let's go ahead and update each of these links. The items here at the bottom, the per item selectors here, those are for our icons. We set all the attributes globally for all menu items and then apply our icons one at a time. Okay, great. Next step is to figure out what selector, what makes each of these links unique. So I can see here that the old Fluid ID isn't going to work with Classic. So let's work our way through the HTML and see what the ID is for Classic. Oh, there it is. Add to homepage. Add to homepage. That makes sense. Great. Now we want to find the nav bar. So continue working our way down, clicking through the HTML. We find add to nav bar. That's perfect. And then we have add to favorites. Clicking away through the HTML again. Add to favorites. And perfect. The top 3 are complete. Okay, now let's work with the bottom 3. So these 3, first thing we need to do is make space on the, move the items to the right to make space on the left. Let's see if we can find a selector that is unique to these items that will help us do that. So we see the HTML here. They're just hyperlinks. They're not embedded in PS menu section, PS menu item. They don't have list items around them. They're just the bare links styled as block elements. That's perfect. If I were doing this in real life, I actually probably would have done the entire thing this way. Just eliminate a lot of that HTML. Here I see the multi-channel framework. The multi-channel console has an ID. Okay, let's go to the sources and let's just append that as part of a list. We're going to make a list of selectors. And so the attributes below are going to apply to this list of selectors. And again, it's the before selector. Oh, that's great. My multi-channel console moved over. Okay, let's go over to the next element. It is a header to my preferences. We'll apply that one again, ID selector, before, and sign out. It's very important as you're trying to select these IDs, you notice the sign out hyperlink is right below that. If I were to click that, it would sign me out directly, eliminating all the CSS I've worked so hard to mock up here in the browser. So I'm going to carefully click on the sign out ID and then paste that in here as well. Perfect. Now all the items have shifted over. We could stop here, but I want to apply the My Preferences icon here to the My Preferences. In our Fluid session, in the Fluid episode, we used a person user icon. So we'll continue with that. All we need though is the My Preferences ID. We'll go to the bottom here and apply that. You know what? We can simplify all of this CSS for the selector here and just go with the ID directly. That's great. Okay, now question. If we could simplify these lower ones by just using a single ID selector, why can't we do that here? Why does this selector have to be so complicated? That's a great question. Let's work our way up here to the top to see the answer to that. So here I have the add to homepage. Add to homepage. And what I'm going to do is simplify our selector. So it is just the ID selector. Now we actually could simplify our selector quite a bit here. Let's just keep working on simplifying. Add to homepage. Okay, it's still working. Still working. Okay, but I'm going to get rid of this final selector here, and you notice it's no longer working. Why is that? It has to do with selector specificity. If you have two selectors or multiple rules that all apply to the same element, and they're styling the same attribute, as we see here, we're styling the content. And down below, we're styling the content. The most specific selector wins. Now up here, we're generically applying, not by ID, we're generically applying to all links within PS menu section that are children of the action link container. So it's hitting 3 at one time. But down here, we're saying, hey, just grab that one item. Unfortunately, this selector, the browser doesn't see this selector as more specific than the higher selector. So the higher selector wins. It's applying this content, which is the zero length string or no content, over instead of, in place of, this selector. So we need to make this selector more specific than the higher selector. This is all it takes to make it more specific. So this is how I would go forward. This is what I would carry into production. Okay, great. We've got it all mocked up here. Let's see how to persist this. So we're going to start just like we did with Fluid. We're going to copy that CSS, go over to Application Designer, and create a new freeform style sheet. I'll paste my CSS, save this as JSM menu icons FF. Now when we created the Fluid style sheet, we named it JSM menu icons FLFF. Of course, the JSM being our site-specific prefix, and the FL for Fluid and the FF for Freeform. In this case, I'm dropping the FL because this one's for Classic. But what about this? What if we chose a naming convention of, say, CL for Classic? Does that make sense? Absolutely. But do we need to do that? I don't know. I'm kind of torn between the two, and I'm going to let you make the decision. On the one hand, yes, I do want to. Now that we have Fluid, hey, we should probably be denoting between or designating this one's Fluid, that one's Classic. We didn't do that in the past. So we have hundreds, thousands of style sheets out there that aren't marked as Classic. Why? Because Classic was the rule. That's all there was. Today, Fluid is the exception. So we could just say, hey, you know, Fluid's the exception. Let's just document the exception and stick with Classic and say everything else that's not marked as Fluid, that's Classic. This is good enough right here. So I'm going to do that. I'm just going to stick with that. Now, in our Fluid episode, we modified an Oracle delivered definition to be the carrier for our CSS to apply to all Fluid components. Fortunately, with Classic, we don't have to do that. We actually have two options with Classic, and it depends on how global you want to be with applying the style sheet. If you want it to be on a per theme basis, then we would use the attribute-based branding module to inject the style sheet. But if you truly want it to be global, to apply across all classic pages regardless of theme, then we can use the global branding system options. So let's do that. I'm going to navigate into PeopleTools. You know what? I'm going to do this in a new window. We have all of this mocked up here, and I'm actually afraid to lose it. So I'm going to navigate to PeopleTools and Portal, Branding, Branding System Options. And right here in the additional style sheet objects, we can place our new style sheet and then press the Save button. Do you want to save your changes to the branding system options? Yes, absolutely. All right, now we see the actions menu. Still looks the old classic approach. I'm going to refresh. And it now has our new fluid icons. Going back to the query manager, if I reload this, we see that it is now loading those icons to match fluid from the server. That's great. Now at JSMpros, we teach PeopleTools concepts and UX concepts like this nearly every day. Our live virtual studio is ready to host your next remote distributed virtual training session. Contact us. We would love to help you prepare a training plan. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more content. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.